Hi everyone, welcome. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and that sovereignty was never ceded. My name's Taylor, I'm from Pitch Portal, and welcome to Redefining Innovation and Civic and Cultural Spaces. I'm going to introduce our panellists. So on the far left, my left, we have Samantha Hamilton. Samantha is the Head of Collections, Preservation and Access at Arts Centre Melbourne. She's also just about to complete her PhD at the University of Melbourne with the thesis topic, Best Practice in Conservation Programs for Remote Aboriginal Communities. Next, in the middle, we have Dr. Ryan Jefferies. Ryan is the Head of Programs for Science Gallery Melbourne and a passionate advocate of science and arts in equal measures. He's the former curator of the Harry Brooks Allen Museum of Anatomy and Pathology, oh, that was a mouthful, and has a PhD in infectious disease research. And on my left here, we have Edward Blake, who is an American expat living in Australia and an interaction designer at Art Processes, an experimental design consultancy specialising in rich, immersive visitor experiences for museums. Prior to moving to Oz, Ed was at Local Projects, an award-winning experience design firm specialising in museums and public spaces. Now, at Pitch Portal, a lot of our research has been around the relationships between community, identity, art and capital and how that's shaped by digital culture. We've been thinking a lot about the idea of spaces, most especially civic and cultural spaces, and how they might provide a little bit of a haven from the paradox of consumption, a place where we can feel not like consumers but like citizens or even people. But with the world and the cultural sector along with it, increasingly shaped by a new kind of discourse that we're all familiar with here, like scale and growth and disruption and innovation. What does it mean to innovate in the arts? In 2020, what does it mean to be an arts or cultural institution and a civic space? How can we manage institutional as well as moral responsibility to be of and for the public? Samantha, I'll let you lead in with this one.
Thank you. I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we meet and their elders past and present and the ones emerging. We won't need those. So I thought I might just sort of start talking about, sort of define it a little bit from my experience. Thank you. That's really sweet. I guess from my experience, our cultural institutions really sort of represent a place where we, share the arts. They're sort of leaders in the way that people participate and engage with the arts in a physical way, and certainly with digital as time has been passing. So, we have exhibitions and we have public programs, we do research. It's all about connecting communities with artworks. And I guess when I think about a civic space, it's quite a different platform in the sense that I sort of imagine them as a place where it's much more supposed to be a free space where there's sort of, no limits and people can share their ideas. I think the challenge lies in that our cultural institutions aren't necessarily free in that way. They are state and public, they're government-owned organisations mostly. So you don't sort of have that freedom of speech in a way that I think a civic space would be defined. So they've sort of operated in a model where, the expertise has been very much internally. We've looked at our cultural institutions and we've had, our curators or our researchers, our scientists, who pretty much talk to the audiences about their expertise and their interpretations and their knowledge systems. And I think that's sort of, it's a bit of a challenge, and it's sort of where we're trying to sort of break down that sort of old-fashioned methodology in a way, with where we're moving in the future. It's very much obviously, museums are moving away from being very much sort of a passive space. You might have experienced this yourselves when you go to an art gallery. You're sort of standing there and you're the visitor and you're passive in a sense where you're just observing things that you're being told. Whereas our profession is very much moving to a space where we're much more visitor focused. We're really wanting to engage with people and the customers and the communities and actually have lots of representation. But it's a challenge because it's a very difficult thing to do, and it's a mindset, that's quite difficult to change. So one of the things that I've been thinking about is really, I think the way to solve that is these institutions have got challenges, and some of them are, for example, financial. We do rely on government funding to be able to do our work. So, I think what we have to do is balance three things, I think are the key things, which are community. Obviously, we need to balance our engagement and our interaction with stakeholders. We need to absolutely balance commerce, because we do need to be financially viable and sustainable to be able to operate. But then we also have to balance culture. So I think those three things are sort of, in a way, in opposition with each other, but they actually present opportunities as well. I mean, we could talk. I mean, it would be nice to talk together about those things, but I think it's sort of the platform of where we need to go. It's about sort of being inclusive and sort of talking much more about sort of real issues that are sort of out there in the community as well.
Amazing. Edwin and Ryan, anything to add?
I mean, I certainly agree with the idea of changing it from kind of a one-way channel of an institution kind of articulating their viewpoint to creating a dialogue where it's basically, a conversation going back and forth. And that's kind of where a place like Art Processors and the digital tools we build often facilitate those dialogues inside of galleries or inside of museums.
I would totally agree with that. I guess many traditional cultural institutions have been seen as quite elitist, focusing on certain community groups and are quite inaccessible to others. So I think we're seeing a shift away from that. And part of that is the rise of kind of pop-up museums, more community involvement in the curatorial process. So it really is audience-led development of exhibition programs and seasons for these institutions.
Amazing. So we've already a little bit touched on this, but I guess one thing that is definitely happening in Melbourne is it's evolving quickly. There's emerging cultures and there's emerging communities. So with these rapidly evolving communities and new voices that we want to represent and engage with, how do we engender a sense of belonging? And how can technology aid in engendering this connection? Ryan, I'll start with you.
It's such a great question, and I think it links to what I said previously in terms of audience first. There's such diverse communities. How do we make cultural institutions so much more accessible? I think we're seeing a shift in terms of institutions like libraries, community art centres, who are really taking the lead in this space in terms of bringing their audience in to kind of develop things specific for them. I'll give the example just in terms of Science Gallery, because Science Gallery is a new cultural institution that is coming to Melbourne and is quite unconventional, but really is a leader in some of this kind of practice. So Science Gallery is part of a global network of, in the future, 12 galleries, all with a common mission to inspire young people, and our target audience is 15 to 25-year-olds, with the collision of arts and science. So it's really around interdisciplinary. But this target audience of 15 to 25-year-olds is not really catered for a lot within the cultural institution. It's a really difficult community to engage with, and Science Gallery really puts them at the heart and centre of everything that we do. So it really is around bringing these community groups in at all stages of development of programs to allow them to feel like they belong. It really is what they want, and that opportunity to really interact with works. I guess in terms of that idea of how is technology influencing that, we're seeing a real shift in terms of artworks, exhibitions, in terms of how people interact with them. And it really is, again, the audience seeing themselves at the heart and centre of the works. So I think we're shifting away from the idea of just seeing a work on the wall, but what happens when a visitor comes in and can interact with a work, that then they contribute to that work. So it could be as simple as an image of themselves being incorporated into an installation. It really becomes more personal and about that target audience.
Oh yeah, I mean, I was going to say another in conjunction with that is around a real important consideration for relevance for that audience, because I think oftentimes everybody, there's no institution out there that's not thinking about how to create that sense of belonging for a large group of people, large audiences. But I think really you have to hit the point of relevance for them to get involved. And I think that if you unpack it, is kind of around positive cognitive effect and also like low effort. So some of the stuff that Ryan's talking about is exactly that, where you don't have to put forth tremendous effort to get involved. And I can think of also, meeting different people along their terms as opposed to kind of the institution's terms. I could think we did at Art Process, we did a project with Museums Victoria and Melbourne University around the Donald Thompson collection, and so we had a lot of First Nations people involved. And one of the things they said to us was, "These are not objects or artifacts; these are belongings." And we really took that on board. And from that point forward, we really thought in their terms and made sure that, as we developed that exhibition, that was a key consideration.
Did you find that in using their language that shaped what you made?
Yeah, in ways. I mean, it certainly, and they, after the fact, said to us, it's really interesting how this all played out, because it actually is a new way for other institutions to behave around these belongings. Mm-hmm. Because as you can imagine, there's tension there around returning these belongings back to the communities. Mm. And so what we had provided was, by doing things like augmented reality and a virtual reality scene that you could partake in, they basically said, now that you have 3D scans of this that the institution has, they can keep those, and we actually want the belongings back. And so it was kind of a new relationship for the belongings in the community and this institution that owns the rights to them. So it's very interesting.
And do you see a pattern with, 3D printing and cultural artifacts and the ability to, move to decolonising our spaces by using 3D printing? Is that something that's in the conversations in cultural institutions?
Absolutely. There's a lot of that happening internationally, but also nationally, absolutely, in that First Nation space. But I was actually going to go back, because I'd like to talk more about First Nations a bit later, but I think I'd like to go back to the fact that, we are obviously all using the tech. We're trying to find new ways to engage with our audiences. Something that we've been doing at Arts Centre Melbourne. So Arts Centre Melbourne, for those from Melbourne, is a performing arts centre. And whilst I have my experience has been in the galleries and the museum environment, Arts Centre Melbourne holds this incredible Australian performing arts collection that's, over 690,000 objects that sort of tell the stories of our performing arts history. So incredible artists, who have been contemporary music artists or, opera singers or ballet dancers, and these people's stories, they're really quite incredible in how these objects, represent these people's lives and meaning. And so whilst Arts Centre Melbourne is incredible in the space of performing arts and has always been sort of linking to communities, and there's been all sorts of contentious topics, I guess, that have been on our stages. I guess that's sometimes where I see that innovation happening, is that people on stages can often say quite radical things or do sort of outrageous things, and then they become mainstream. The collection has never sort of had that sort of front focus, because the core business is this performing arts aspect. And so whilst I've been there for the last 3 years, we've been thinking a lot about how can we sort of make this collection a lot more relevant to our community? How can we bring out these stories? And when, of course, we're thinking about climate change, and we're thinking about, political issues and migrants. In the circus, for example, there was often people that would be viewed as the other or difference, or, we've got stories where there was even First Nations people who pretended that they weren't First Nations and that they were Spanish descent or something like that. So that collection has got all these stories that we could use for these sorts of contemporary topics, and we should be using them for debate, and we should be, talking about really important issues. Something that we've done recently is exploring technology. We partnered with Deakin, and we've been doing this VR project where we've digitised using some medical equipment with this dermatology clinic here in Melbourne. They've got this incredible state-of-the-art equipment that scans bodies for our skin cancers. So we used it to digitise some incredible opera costumes, because they're enormous, and it was just easy to press a button and take an image with 92 cameras all at once. So we've done that, but now we're sort of thinking about the stories we want to tell. And something that I've been learning through the performing arts is that there's real issues in mental health. And I mean, we were just talking about that, but it's really predominant in the performing arts. people work in dark spaces, or artists have got anxiety issues. There's some real severe issues that go on and that have never sort of been spoken about. And Arts Centre Melbourne is sort of leading this whole movement about mental health and mental well-being. So we're trying to think about our VR project and using these costumes, and how will we get people to come into an experience and sort of talk about mental health and experience mental health. There's a lot happening in the field with mental health and VR, and there's tests going on. So I guess for us as cultural institutions trying to use these collections, we're really trying to use the tech and find ways to actually talk to our communities and bring everyone in and talk about real issues.
I think that's really interesting, what you're saying, especially about the VR and the ability to, I guess, in terms of otherness, right? Like VR has the capacity to view yourself as the other, which is incredibly important, both from a mental health perspective and having some distance, but also in engendering like connection between different communities. So yeah, that's really fascinating. I guess my next question is going back to Edward, what you were talking about with adopting new languages and your processes with working with specific communities. What does innovation actually mean in the arts? And does that differ from the tech world kind of doesn't really exist because everything's technology, but how does that differ from the tech world?
I'll be candid, I didn't tell Taylor this before, but innovation is one of those words I truly deeply hate. As George Orwell said, words are such feeble things, and innovation is a particularly feeble word. But I don't want to punt entirely. I tend to think innovation speaks to the idea of taking two or three totally disparate and unconnected tools or ideas and connecting them together and creating these juxtapositions that often engender new opportunities for whether it be visitors, audiences, users, and the like. And so, if somebody like myself working in art processors, we often explore new worlds of technology. So things like combining motion tracking technology with an online collection, or using, Google had some good examples like their Quick Draw, where it's like using machine learning and kids' drawings and tens of thousands of them to actually get this system that can predict what you're trying to draw. And so to me, that's innovation in ways. I think there's a flip side to that that's the more important part, which is that innovation imparts meaning and purpose for the audience or the visitor. Because innovation in and of itself, it's not all that, it doesn't do as much as if you can actually provide the context needed to really enlighten and provide purpose. Seb actually was here earlier talking about Acme, and purpose was a big thing he talked about, and I certainly agree that what you try to achieve is providing purpose for the visitor.
Rather than just disrupting for the sake of it.
Yeah, for bells and whistles, and because the tech, in 5 years, your tech is going to look like an old toaster, so you should really work to make sure that it has good stories and meaning behind it.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. So if we weren't going to use the word innovation, if we're, I guess, what you said, Edward, was kind of, I take from that, it's almost like using technology as an opportunity to explore and bring different elements from different sectors, which obviously, Ryan, you'd be super across being the hybrid of an arts and science man. So maybe what do we see for the future of, I guess, the digital archive versus our cultural spaces, and I guess how we explore and talk about these sectors and talking about them in a vacuum versus, what Science Gallery is doing and really pairing art and science together.
I agree in terms of this definition of innovation, and it is an overused word, but at the heart it is simply that translation of science into something practical. And I think that's where the combination of arts and science and this interdisciplinary practice is really at its core. So Science Gallery is absolutely about innovation and being in this realm of kind of speculative design. So at times we become this kind of DIY speculative design studio where people can become really hands-on with really quite out there kind of concepts. And I'll give you the example of why we've been waiting for our new gallery to be built. We've been in pop-up mode, so we've been doing these pop-up exhibitions over the past 3 years across Melbourne. Last year, the exhibition season was called Disposable, so it was all about waste and sustainability. and what are we doing in terms of this waste challenge. And a real highlight for the whole season's program was this really interesting engineer-artist collaboration. And we commissioned a work called Urinatron, and it was based on this idea that your own pee, that is peed down the toilet every day, is a really valuable resource. So what we did is we encouraged visitors to pee in a cup, and their urine was then added to this system of urine batteries, which generated enough electricity to charge mobile phones. So it became a mobile phone charging station. Then all of that urine was recycled into drinkable water. So it's a really great example of this a combination of art and science in a really practical outcome. Why don't we have these in our homes? Why aren't we charging our mobile phones from our own pee?
Ryan's going to be at the startup stage after this, looking for investors. So, no, that's amazing. I also heard that there's certain Australian trees that can't grow without human urine. So definitely, that's, I guess, the real purpose of these cultural institutions is to, I guess, dismantle the binaries between the sectors that we view and, challenge societal norms. So peeing in a cup to charge our phones is, that sounds very needed. I'm not joking. Someone should do that for sure. So if we weren't going to use the word innovation, Edward, seeing as you hate that word, I'm going to start with you. What would you use instead?
That's a tough one. I mean, I like the word juxtaposition and kind of the new in ways where it's as Ryan, I think Ryan hit it. From the combination of art and science, is this juxtaposition of sometimes perceived opposing ideas that come up with the new. Yeah,
it's kind of scavenger theory almost there, which is really cool.
And I would add just kind of solutions. It's kind of finding a solution to a problem, really, isn't it? And that links so strongly in with this idea of innovation.
And I also think it's social responsibility. Like, that's what innovation to me is in those spaces, is that, we have the responsibility and have the capacity to be a place for social innovation and problem solving. Exactly. Like, there's some great examples even in Europe where they had some project called, I think it was something like Digital Citizen or something like that, Citizen something, where, in communities, in cities, they're going out to the people and placing real-world problems and using open-source platforms to basically have these conversations where they're solving noise pollution or, lighting issues or what have you. So I feel like our cultural institutions can be innovative, and I don't know what the word is, but I think it's about sort of having social impact outcomes. That's really where we should be.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess it's always about the purpose first and then how you get there second. So my next question is in an increasingly digitally driven world, how do civic and cultural spaces balance the act of questioning issues like data usage, algorithms and automation, while also employing these practices themselves? Obviously, there's a lot of positives to using new technology, both from a programming perspective and in, I guess, the experience of people walking through the space. But obviously as well, there's a lot of institutions that are questioning, I guess, data usage and data sovereignty and all of those very real issues that we're looking at. And how do we balance that?
I could think of a number of examples that speak to this. I mean, I think, I would say I would start with a bit of a skeptical take on technology. I don't know how many people know who David Browers is. He's a famous environmentalist from San Francisco. He had a great quote about technology should be presumed guilty until innocent, sort of the inverse of how we treat ourselves in the justice system, in part because often what we know about technology, and specifically new technology, is often what's told to us by those that create it. So you have to be super skeptical in that regard. So, and if you're a civic space, and people are, it's one thing if you're a private entity and you want to employ some of that stuff, but it's another thing if it's a public space. So you have to be super conscious. And I think sometimes people miss the mark in ways. So I remember one time I worked with a big college library out in California, and they came to us, this is when I was at local projects, and they said, oh, we want to have this big interactive wall, and it's all run through machine intelligence and machine learning, and you're a student, and you can explore a topic, and it just tells you everything in the library that you should be reading about that. And I said to them, well, how many librarians do you have? And they said 10. And I sort of said, well, what are they going to do? You know, because they're human curators. They know this stuff. Like, this is especially when you have like specific archives for that individual library. They're the best equipped to do this kind of stuff. And I think another, like, going back to what Seb was saying this morning, the same thing Acme was thinking about. They have this enormous trove of online material, and they're going the other way from this idea of machine learning and machine intelligence to make recommendations. Yes, you can use that as one angle, but really you have a wealth of human knowledge on site, and you should be leveraging that. So I think in some ways that's kind of where thinking about that stuff, that level of skepticism. I don't know, what do you think, Ryan and Samantha?
I would add to that in terms of I feel there's almost this level of tech saturation, and people are wanting to switch off from technology a little bit. I think the key for cultural institutions is around openness and transparency in terms of if we are tracking data in a gallery, to make that really readily known to our audiences. In terms of what Science Gallery do, we have this opportunity to really showcase some of these technologies for people to participate in it, and then make a decision, is this where we want to go into the future? And I'll give the example of another work that we commissioned, and it's a work called Biometric Mirror. It's a collaboration again between an artist and an academic, but it explores this idea of facial biometrics. More and more we're being tracked, we're having lots and lots of images taken of our faces. What's happening to all of that data? And do we have any control of that? And the answer really is no. I guess major institutions, governments are keeping that and then making decisions based on some of that. We're seeing the rise of certain algorithms where you can then tell how aggressive someone is just based on their face morphology with a very low degree of accuracy, of course, but what happens if these decisions are being made? So this was the underlying premise for this whole work, and it was a collaboration between artist Lucy McRae and academic Niels Waters. And this is now touring globally, where people can come in, have their face assessed, but really opening up that dialogue and that role of cultural institutions of not saying this is how it is and this is the facts. It's more around opening up that question. Is it a direction that we want to go in, having first-hand experience of it?
I absolutely agree, and I think my perspective on that very much is that anything that we do should be made with people, you know. So if we're doing, you know, the algorithms, the coding, everything that we're doing should actually have a purpose, and that it should be transparent, and that we should be doing it with people, so that there's this full awareness, and actually whatever we're producing has real impact and outcomes.
One other thing I think of, and actually I see a colleague back there, Blair, who worked on this with me, is we did an exhibition at Mona with the artist Simon Denny, and basically Simon wanted to employ the O, which is the mobile device you're given as you go into the museum, and basically have it do all these things as you go through the gallery space that he did his exhibition for and sculptures for. And then he and Mona together basically wanted at the end that you could transparently see everything that, so you'd been doing stuff, take a selfie, you scan some images, you do some AR, you can see some videos play on the device, and then when you get to the last room, you scan some areas and it's basically regurgitating all of the data that had been gathered while you were going through that space. So it'd see like your location, it certainly had your facial recognition and the sentiment of your, like, again, poor interpretation of the sentiment of your face, but all that kind of stuff. And really, to the point of showing how, not only is it doing this, but how much it was doing. So, Mona has years and years of data from those devices, and it was all being displayed to give that transparency, which I think is totally true, a very valid point, that especially as a cultural institution or a civic space should be really open and transparent with that.
Would you say, I guess, using technology, that's a broad term, but using facial recognition technology or data to understand your customer from a private sector would have a very different goal than a civic or cultural institution. But obviously we're using a lot of the same technology. So my question is, what languages, what culture and ethics are we wanting to feed into that technology in our civic and cultural spaces, and how might that differ from the private sector? That's we'll start with Ryan.
I think there is a big difference. Of course, the commercial sector is all about finance and making a dollar. And I actually bought a microchipper here, actually, to kind of demonstrate that of where we could be headed in terms of society, and the commercial sector is really pushing. This is actually to inject a microchip under the skin, and it was something I was considering doing, but have shied away from it now. But there are actually commercial industries that is required for their employees to be microchipped to track their every move. Of course, cultural institutions have the opportunity to flip that. It isn't just solely about commercial gain. It's about cultural awareness of giving to the communities. I think where Science Gallery lays in this as well is this idea of very much becoming a living laboratory, where, again, you've got an opportunity for people to be really participatory as this technology kind of develops. I've already touched on the facial biometrics, but we've done other kind of projects where, for example, we did a mass blood typing out on the streets of Melbourne, and this was in front of the State Library. It was a new technology where people could have their blood type within a minute, and normally it takes days for that to be processed and for you to get your result. So we were offering this for free. We had thousands of people come through and have their blood type taken. But of course there's a lot of sensitive information around that. And it was all about consent. So people then were consenting to be part of that project, knowing that it would have some research outcomes as well.
And I think that's, really important, that point about consent, because I think that's where it absolutely lies. Because when we're thinking about all this tech and all this data being gathered, I guess my concerns really lie in consent, in the fact that, what about intellectual property? Are we thinking enough about those sorts of things? And I guess I've got a lot of experience in the fact of even First Nations people and sort of that sort of aspect. So I think even all of us in our everyday life, are we really thinking about the issues related to intellectual property and copyright and data sharing and use? And whilst it's in transparency, I do think there's still issues around consent, and I think there's a lot of, even in our institutions, there is data being collected that I'm not really sure a lot of people do consent to actually, and really are aware of what's happening, and that's actually being used and stored properly.
Yeah, and even the idea of consent, like we can say, yes, I signed up to MySpace when I was 14, but I didn't know what I was in for. So it's, I guess, the idea as well, like not only are you experimenting with how technology is shaping society in so many ways in these institutions, but you also have to do your best to educate the people that you're working with and your citizens to see the future of what they might be signing up for, which is which would be a really, really hard task, I guess. So how do we encourage critical thinking, new ideas, and the imagination of alternative futures during a time where we're increasingly reliant on biased machine learning for both understanding and inspiration? So we touched on this before with the idea of the the digital archive curating how we perceive the world in lots of ways. I think what's really beautiful about, our civic and cultural spaces is the idea that finally you can get outside the algorithms, walk into these places, and a lot of the time it's not just made by a computer that arguably has a lot of bias in it. So, Samantha, I might lead with you here, given your PhD in archiving.
Yep. I think we've got a lot of work to do in sort of. I'm gonna pretty much focus this question around First Nations and talk about. We've got a lot of work to do in these spaces around flipping authority and a bit like we sort of started off talking that the institutions have been the expert. And everyone else sort of in society is a bit passive. There's been a lot of work happening in institutions around First Nations people and sort of who has the authority and who actually has the intellectual knowledge and who has the right to tell those stories. So we've been a bit slow in Australia, unfortunately. It's been sort of on the table for about, since about the 90s, I think. There's been movements where people were recognising that these collections were being held in our institutions. How did they actually come into the institutions? Who were these curators and experts who were talking about them, and where were the First Nations people? And at the moment, just to add to that, I guess looking globally, like in the States, for example, there was a law, I think it was passed in the early 90s. It's called NAGPRA is the acronym, but it really is all around grave goods and the fact that, there was all this pillaging going on and people went and stole Native American people's cultural materials and put them in all these big institutions everywhere. And so this law basically came in which said that, anything that was a grave good needed to be repatriated back to communities. So this can be sacred objects like, it could be a bowl, a ceremonial bowl, it could be a headdress, it could be a range of things. So that was good in the States because it sort of pushed this big movement of, sort of First Nations people coming in and requesting their material back and making the institutions sort of have to be morally and ethically sort of responsible and reactive. In Australia, we don't have any such laws. So I don't know how many people know, but up until 1967, our First Nations people didn't even exist, basically. And so we don't really have anything like that in Australia to give our First Nations people authority. So it's been a bit of a struggle. And what's really great is at the moment there's a national project that's being rolled out by our Australians Museums and Galleries Association, and it's been funded by the federal government, and it's called the Indigenous Roadmap. And so over the next 10 years this sort of strategic plan that's being rolled out and signed up by all the national organisations to sort of flip that authority. So it's really about, acknowledging our First Nations people, giving them the opportunity to tell their own stories, employing them, getting them on our boards and not just saying we're going to consult with someone and we pay them some money and we get them to come in and do a project with them. Like that's, sort of, we're beyond that nowadays. I think we've got that ethical responsibility where we actually are, we recognise who these people are and that we give them the power to do that work. So there's a lot going on in that space, and I think, it's really important for us to move forward there.
How do you find that with working with First Nations people, which is traditionally a lot of the storytelling is oral, right? So obviously a lot of ours isn't. So how do you manage that?
Don't worry about this time. What's really... So are you talking about that in a cultural institution perspective?
Yeah,
do you want to just take...
Yeah, completely. I watched a doco put on by Melbourne Uni about the First Nations relationship with Makassar. And how they used to trade on the trade winds. Yeah. And that was something that I had obviously no idea about. And the documentary is incredibly important as a piece of, I guess, education from that. But so many of the First Nation stories aren't recorded.
No, they're not.
Yeah, so how do you move forward with that? And
so what's happening in that space is a lot of digital tech stuff, in the fact that lots of obviously language has been something that's been sort of lost along the way. So when we're trying to translate these oral stories, I mean, some communities have actually lost their languages completely, which is a real challenge in itself. But where it hasn't, there's actually big movements across the whole of Australia where people are actually digitally now recording things. So that's sort of a space that's becoming really prolific and active. Indigenous communities themselves have, everyone's got a smartphone generally, and people are really actively creating their own narratives. They're even taking photos of themselves and then creating their own collages or storytelling and stuff. So,
amazing.
Yeah,
we really have to game the algorithms to sort of spearhead them away from, I guess, any kind of bias. But the great thing is, I guess, it's still kind of early days on the internet. So
absolutely,
yeah. That's great. So Edward and Ryan, a question for you. In terms of working with algorithms that might have bias or do have bias, and using, machine learning for programming and the likes, like how do you navigate that? And is it a discussion that you have? And how much of the planning is kind of just instinct or a hunch in the face of, I guess, the data that we have in front of us?
I mean, that's a tricky question. I mean, oftentimes you can work with data sets that have already been trained, but oftentimes when you want to get into specifics, and especially in, when you're in a storytelling mode, you often have to incorporate your own training into those algorithms. So you do have that wiggle room. I can think of an example where we were tasked with using what I mentioned earlier about Google Quick Draw and finding that that system's trained, but it's basically trained on 100 specific animals that are mostly North American. It doesn't apply to Australia. And so we had to basically go in and retrain it towards our own, flora and fauna and that. So you do have some control, but I think it's really hard. Regardless, there's going to be some angle that has to be, there has to be some context or a meaning imparted, and everybody can take it their own way. I mean, I know this is a bit of a tangent, but I was thinking about this in relation to the news, right? Like every day when I find out that, I love to find out for the New York Times, then immediately flip to Fox News because it's the same fact essentially, but it's presented in totally different ways. And so I always like to see how they both spin it. And I think that's the one approach to thinking about these algorithms is that, you'll never get one that's impartial or perfect, but you just want to be aware and think about the flip side of what it is that how you're constructing that.
I would just add, and it really is around diversity, is that the elephant in the room still is that most cultural institutes are colonial, very white institutions. There is still really a lack of diversity in terms of the peoples that work within these institutions. I think this is really at the core of so many of these biases that then translate out into the technologies, the algorithms that are often purely developed by older white men. So touching on earlier comments as well of just around that importance of flipping the diversity of cultural institutes. We need to be employing people from as many diverse backgrounds as possible, and particularly in positions of power as well. And touching on this idea in terms of First Nations knowledge and peoples, there is this real opportunity for more First Nations peoples to be employed by the cultural institutions, to be high up within those institutions and be making decisions around what knowledge is shared. And touching on that idea of language, for Science Gallery's first exhibition, Blood, that we did here in Melbourne, we actually worked with the Indigenous language unit at University of Melbourne, and it was capturing some of those lost languages through community consultation across Australia, and simply capturing the First Nations word for blood across over 150 different language groups. And there was so many people, so many visitors who just had this ignorance about the cultural diversity across Australia.
Wow, that's crazy. Edward, going back to what you were saying, especially talking about the new ACME, the idea of this amazing digital archive we have, but then also maybe the importance of I don't want to say human curator, but I'm going to. What's the role of the curator moving forward with this digital archive with like machine learning? Is it more important? Does it just have to be more varied? I guess I'm thinking of digitally, your Netflix versus your Mubi, right? Like there's somebody there that's a human that's curating that versus something that's made for you. But I guess the problem with that is that randomness or a change in opinion is a little bit harder. Yeah,
I mean, I think that there's a couple things there. I mean, I think that machine intelligence can be used by a curator as a tool. They're really good at picking up patterns that we don't pick up. So you can counterbalance your own biases or curatorial eye with that. But I tend to find when you try and allow those algorithms to run it alone, they don't work that well. And I'm not talking about, arts institutions. I'm talking anywhere. Like, Spotify tries it. In actuality, it's not that much intelligence from machines. It's actually going, if you like this song, and this song, we know from other visitors you're probably going to like this song. It's not as complex as you think. And another example is like Netflix. You see Netflix rolled out this bid for $1 million to come up with a rating system that worked. $1 million. Nobody was able to crack it. And now they basically have a thumbs up, thumbs down. So while there is lots of, talk and dare I say hype, and maybe in 10 years time I'll regret calling it hype around machine intelligence and learning, right now in and of itself alone, it doesn't provide a great experience.
Samantha or Ryan, anything to add?
Not really. I think it's, I think we always need the humans at the heart of it, The curator absolutely has a role and should always have a role, but it's about connecting with communities, as we said earlier, just taking it back to that, really.
Amazing. And I guess a really interesting way to do that is through these like ephemeral kind of pop-up spaces where there's more room to experiment and I guess try new things. Is that a big focus moving forward for each of the institutions that you're working with and obviously your agency?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to that. I mean, it's at the core of every project that Art Processors takes on. And actually, David Walsh, founder of Mona and the director of the company, has a great quote that's, inspiration is a poor substitute for iteration. And that's exactly that. It's experimentation and prototyping. And that's when you can, I think it's one of the biggest challenges for arts institutions and civic spaces around employing digital is that their existing model often pairs up with exhibition design where it's like, oh, we've done a new gallery development and we got this capital funding and it's done and the digital is done, when in reality, it's only when you open those doors that you actually really start to get the real learnings from what you've built. And so it's often painful for us in that the relationship's basically ramping down when the real user experience and that kind of stuff starts to go up. So what we work for with at Art Processors is a continued engagement with those institutions so that we can always iterate and improve. A good example is the Art Gallery in New South Wales, which we've worked on for 4 or 5 years, where we manage a lot of their mobile guides for all their touring exhibitions and that kind of stuff. And they'll tell you as well as we would that each time we do it, it gets better and better and better to enhance the experience of the visitor. So,
Yeah, I'm certainly interested in the whole idea of the pop-up and the temporary and the labs and all those sorts of things. And I think we all are, because it's all about just trying to be relevant, trying to, like we were saying before, have that social responsibility, make sure that we're connecting with communities, that we're not just sort of dictating content. So I think just generally and globally, I think we're all just definitely in that space where we're trying to absolutely just keep testing ideas and prototyping and communicating and learning and being relevant.